Okay, so both of our readings were very different. The textbook was about multicultural counseling and diversity when we're dealing with trauma, and The Body Keeps the Score was basically about the brain and how trauma affects the brain. And it was a little technical, you know. Um, I've had to memorize the parts of the brain and everything before, but um, the way it described what the function of each part of the brain was, the author did it in a really nice way that even I could understand it. So, and it made a lot of sense when they related it to trauma. So let's talk about the textbook first. And it was only one chapter in the textbook, and it was on the chapter Crisis and Trauma, Counseling in Social and Cultural Contexts. And so I just remember one of my professors, pretty famous guy in certain disciplines, Dr. Christian Becker. He did a lot of research on not only like biblical things, but social anthropology. And one of his studies was he went to a small town, and that town had had a disaster, and I forget, it was either a fire or a flood, and but it destroyed a lot of the town. We're going to go with flood. And so rather than doing a quantitative study, he did a qualitative study. And a qualitative study does a lot of in-depth interviews with individuals about whatever subject it is or whatever they experienced. And the one thing that he found was that when they were talking about themselves, if they would reference something a while ago, they would reference it as before the flood. Such and such happened, or such and such happened. That was before the flood. Or if they would talk about something that happened more recently, like maybe they moved into a home that they renovated, or they, did some repairs or something like that. Or maybe they got married or whatever it is. But they would refer to that as after the flood. So the traumatic experience, the crisis, acted as a demarcation line in their life's timeline. And a lot of times when I work with clients, and especially families, I like to do two things. With families, I like to do a genogram with them, and I don't do it for them. We do it together so that they understand what a genogram is. And I use different colors for different emotional relationships or lack of relationships. But it's a really nice way to draw an image of their family system. And the second thing I do with them is a timeline of important life events. And by important, it could be a negative event, or it could be a positive event. It could be, oh, that's when I got married, that's when I had kids, or it could be that's when I got divorced, that's when somebody passed away. So by important, it could be positive or negative. But imagine if we would darken things or make things different color on that life timeline, And for people in this town that experienced this disaster, probably one of the darkest or most highlighted events would have been the disaster, even if they survived, because it created such emotional stress and trauma for them. So even if their house survived, there was fear, there was a struggle, there was caring about other people in the community. There was seeing the devastation of their hometown where they grew up. There was a loss of jobs. There was uncertainty. So all of those emotions were tied up with this disaster in their town. And, I think that was just what a lot of the context of this chapter reminded me of, because even though it did mention individual trauma, a lot of the discussion in the chapter was about trauma for groups of individuals, and different kinds of groups. It could be cultural groups, it could be towns or communities, it could be all different religions or races, or, there's all types of groups of people. So when they talk about trauma in groups of people, they usually call it a social context. What if a trauma took place, or a disaster or a crisis took place in a specific or with a specific social context? And I was just wondering if anybody, and you can just shout it out, if you're online or here, what crises would affect a large population or a large group of people, either in the United States or the world today? Maybe you've heard something in the news, can you think of anything that's going on now or in the past week or so that is affecting large groups of people? Yeah.
Like climate disasters and wildfires and
Yeah, okay. So like the wildfires in Canada or in Hawaii, that's a good example. Yeah. What else? Yeah.
war.
Yeah, the war in Ukraine. And the way, one way that affected them was not only the devastation of cities, or the loss of life, but also so many people left and became refugees. Yeah. What else?
I was thinking school shootings. I don't think any has happened in the past week or anything, but in general, that's a big one.
Yeah. So school shootings or any type of mass shootings, absolutely. Yeah. So even in these examples, we've got 3 or 4 different types of social contexts, totally different social contexts or groupings of individuals who experience that trauma. And yet, because of the original context, they saw themselves as a group. They could say, well, we're from Maui, or we're, from Northwestern Canada, or we're from Ukraine, or we all went to that same school, but imagine, just like in the story before and after the flood, the trauma also acts as a unifying factor, because they all went through that trauma together. And even though it's such a negative thing, it does create a bond, because they all went through that traumatic experience together. You know, I think sometimes that could be supportive. They could be supportive of one another. Sometimes it could be a reminder of the trauma. So it has both positive and negative effects to it. So those are good examples. And I think that a lot of the examples, we'll talk about it later, but they try to give different examples for different types of social contexts as well. So one of the first things they talk about is cultural influences. And there's a couple vocabulary words they give you. One would be individualism and collectivism. So they're kind of self-explanatory, but different types of societies they either promote individualism and kind of like an individual succeeding and being the best that they could be and being successful, anybody can make it, you know, or it could be a collectivistic society. And, you know, that is when people work for the good of the community. What type of society do you think America is seen from a sociologist viewpoint? Individual or collectivist? Yeah, so what do you think that individualist?
I just think like capitalism and trying to get to the top and.
It's like all the business and money and financial success. Yeah. Can you think of maybe a culture or a society that you might see as collectivist? What do you
Like
think?
Japan, like lots of different Asian cultures. So Japan, China, Indonesia.
Yeah, exactly. So Japan would probably be the highest in that order. And I think that there's some deeper reasons why societies are either individualistic or collective. And one of the reasons, and this is not in the textbook, this is just my personal opinion, is you'll often notice that an individual society is often guilt-based and a collective society is often shame-based. So a shame-based society, like Native Americans, would normally have a shame-based society. And so an example of that would be one of the problems when Native Americans were on, like in schools and they were on a sports team, like they were racing, running a race. If one of their team members was falling behind, they would wait for them so they could all finish. And they cared more about the collective team than they did winning the race for one person. And, you know, so if they did not help the family or the village or the community, they would bring shame upon themselves, but more importantly, they would bring shame upon their family. That's a different feeling than guilt. Guilt is more individualistic. Guilt is, I did something wrong. I did something I shouldn't have. There's a big difference between the use of the identifier I or we. And I think that really impacts how a society functions, and what their priorities are. And there's positives and negatives for both types. I wish we were a little more collectivistic, or collective, personally, but I think that the second vocab word is about power. And when they're we this was mentioned in the last chapter, but when we have power distance, refers to how much people believe that power is distributed unevenly in a culture or a context. And I think it could be in an organization, it could be in a workplace, it could be in a group of friends, it could be politically, it could be financially, it could be in a city, a state, a country, and depending on who you talk to, you may hear different things. Like if you said to one person, "Oh, how do you think our power is distributed? Is it equitable?" Well, if somebody has power, they're probably going to say, "Yeah, it's very equitable." But if somebody does not have power, then they're more aware of the inequity of the power. And so and when we talk about power, it really refers to so many different things. It could be finances, it could be influence, it could be bias or prejudice, it could be political. There's so many different types of power. So when we talk about power bias, it could be bias about anything. It could be a bias about race or ethnicity or gender identity. So, when we think about social equity, and diversity is more than just, race and ethnicity. It could be anything that creates a difference between people. It could be a disability. It could be our age. That person's too old, or that person's too young, or whatever. The next thing it talks about is basically standards for culturally and contextually competent counseling. The Association for Multicultural Counseling and Development, and Counselors for Social Justice. The Multicultural Counseling Organization within the ACA has made great strides in awareness and, all of the publications and work they've done of this in counseling. And I think they're a great group. I think they've worked very hard to make a difference in counseling and as activists. So one of the things that they talk about, one of the contexts, is marginalized groups. And once again, when we think about diversity includes a lot of different groups, everything from age to gender identity to race to ethnicity to maybe a nationality, so there, when we talk about a marginalized group, um, it could be any type of diverse group that perhaps has been exposed to bias, prejudice, uneven power structures, violence, trauma, war, famine, natural disasters. But you know, we can see a lot of evidence of marginalized people in our own country. When there are national disasters like Katrina, you know, we saw different responses to different groups of people. And it wasn't based on fairness, but it was based on uneven power structures and bias and prejudice and other things. So it's still evident in our society. But when we put all this together and you add, different types of trauma, marginalized groups are hit the hardest and they suffer the most. I don't want to negate anybody's suffering, but when I'm talking like on the world picture, so they gave this example. One day during a monsoon season, there was a big storm and it rained for a long time. The rushing waters washed everything downstream. While a monkey was firmly holding onto a branch of a tree with all of its might, a fish was swimming vigorously against the current. The monkey thought, "My friend is in trouble. I need to help him." And without thinking twice, he reached down and pulled his friend out of the water. So, he wasn't really helping the fish. It was probably hurting the fish by pulling him out of the water. He thought he was helping. I remember a cartoon where they had all different types of animals, and they were all lined up to take a standardized exam. And the exam was climbing trees. And so you had, a couple different animals that lived in trees, but then you had fish and you had, four-legged creatures that lived on land, and you had, all different types of animals. So it was really talking about how the test only measured one thing for one group, those animals that could climb or live in a tree. Whereas fish and land animals and other animals, it really wasn't a fair measurement for them because they had other skills and abilities and they lived a different way. So bias is not always a directed prejudice. It is often a not knowing, So when I used to teach the multicultural class, the one thing I learned from doing mission work with counseling students or living in other cultures for extended periods of time, like India or other cultures, or we're working with different populations in the United States. A lot of times books or textbooks tend to group cultures, and they might say, "Oh, well, this culture has this generality." But when you spend time in any culture or any context, there are so many subcultures within that culture every town is different, every religion within that culture is different, every age group is different because they lived through a different time period. Every family structure is different. So I don't really like, designating certain attributes to entire broad cultures. So what I normally taught instead was to be a humble therapist, to be culturally humble. And that simply means that I don't understand everything about an individual's background or experiences or culture, or how they feel about other cultures. Maybe they had some really negative experiences. Maybe they had some positive experiences. Maybe it's a mix. And so I would always acknowledge the difference in our backgrounds, our experiences, our cultures. But, I would definitely try to convey that I would like to learn about their personal experience, whatever that might be, whatever they felt like sharing with me. I was open to hear it and I was willing to learn about it. It's impossible to learn about every subculture. And the second thing I would do is I would build the counseling relationship on trust. And that might take some time, but it's worth spending that time and building that trusting relationship with every client so that they would feel more comfortable sharing maybe a negative experience they had with perhaps a culture they identify me as part of. They would trust me enough that they could share something negative about an experience, and I would not react negatively. So the trusting relationship, the openness, the acknowledgement of differences, and I think those are probably the most important keys to addressing cultural differences within the counseling relationship. It goes on, it talks about different populations. So it talks about, like, even the statistics on American Indians, Alaskan Native populations. It talks about in the United States, there are 573 tribal nations. There's over 1,000 tribal nations. There's only 573 identified or recognized by our government. And that's because one of the prerequisites to recognizing a group of Native Americans as an identified tribe is that they must have a language. And what happened when either Spanish, English, French came to North America? One of the first things they did was say, hey, you've got to learn our language. And so many indigenous peoples lost their language. So it's like a catch-22. If you don't have a language, you can't be identified as a tribe and receive those benefits from our government. So even these statistics, you have to kind of know a little more about these stats to even use them. So they talk about all the different types of Asian, Hispanic, LGBTQ plus populations. rather than talking about each one of those, I think it's more important to go with, openness and trust and building that counseling relationship. And they do talk about cultural and social awareness. Every client develops in his or her own community. It's important for a counselor to consider the client's context. It's vital for you as a counselor to identify your own cultural and social perspectives. If you have greater awareness of your own cultural and social contexts, you may have a better understanding of your client's world. You may have a better understanding of your own biases that you need to address. Yeah. Let's see. Well, counselor withdrawal. The counseling relationship is a unique social context in which people can hopefully share the details of their abuse and traumas. When a counselor pulls away or avoids difficult conversations, clients experience one more empathic failure, and they can withdraw into isolation. So I think that this is something we often talk about in the skills class. And it's that as people build trust with you and as they share more with you about their traumas and negative experiences in life, if we are uncomfortable as a counselor, and because, it's not a comfortable thing, but if we withdraw as a result of that discomfort, then that puts up another wall between us and our clients. So, yeah, people often say, I want to be a counselor so that I can help people. And they think about all the positive ways to help people, but they rarely think that, yeah, I'm going to spend 20 years listening to horror stories. I remember when a professor who retired, Jeff Samid, and we both spent some years working for Children and Youth Services, he retired and I moved on to a different agency, and but we had spent years doing that together, but with our own clients. And one time we got together and we just sat all afternoon because we had never really processed all of the negativity that we had heard from our clients. And we just told each other anonymously the stories that we had heard and the kids that we had worked with. And it sounds like a really negative thing to do, just telling, but it's really the stories that really impacted us. And it helped us share that experience with another counselor. So it was almost like a critical incident stress debriefing. And, and we should have probably been doing that in some kind of supervision every week. But, they brought us in for that. So, but everybody needs to debrief and to process these things. Yeah, so they use the term collective traumatic experiences. We started off by giving some examples of this, like different shootings with different groups. Sometimes the group might be school kids. Sometimes it might be at a club where, a certain group of people might frequent. It might be a minority, it might be a marginalized group of individuals, might be a LGBT group, but there were shootings in all of those. It could be forced migration and due to war or famine. Could be natural disasters like hurricanes or tsunamis or fires. It could be the Me Too movement and all of the women who have experienced sexual harassment and trauma. It could be historical traumas like apartheid or slavery or the Holocaust, or various massacres or massacres of our indigenous peoples. And you could go on forever enlisting different groups that have experienced this, different collective traumas. But I wanted to see, you're going to have an entire course on multicultural counseling, but I think it's important to include it in every course, and that's called multicultural infusion. How does the topic of multicultural counseling fit into each subject? And so I'm glad they included that chapter in this textbook. Does anybody have any comments or examples or questions regarding that? All right, well, I'm going to stop recording.